So yesterday we finished by watching some videos. What's that? A little Hank Hillish. You gotta do it. Hank Hill, that's how he's kind of vidya. Bobby, you and your vidya games. Something like that. All right. So let's talk about construction. Construction of the batteries. Well, we already watched one of the videos on that. And just to kind of reiterate a couple of points, we have one battery. Remember, we're talking about aircraft lead-acid batteries at this point. One battery consists of a group of cells. Consists of a group of cells connected in series and encased together. In series and encased together. So it's funny. I looked really carefully at this, but it's kind of cool in that. I don't know, I guess this went in a parts store somewhere, but I'm glad we have it, where you've got the economy battery would look like this on the inside, whereas 40 amp hours, 75%, as powerful as original equipment quality, low quality. And you can see that the plates, as we're in the video, because I hate messing with the lead, is you've got a series of different plates in there, right? So it's alternating with the lead oxide, lead oxide, and it's got the cardboard plates in between to keep the lead from touching, because if the lead touches, then it shorts out, so that's no good. And so you got the economy, and then when you get into a better battery, well, they're just going to put bigger and more plates in there, which would be more expensive to make. And the bigger plates, more area is going to give you more amp hours. This one is, what did it say? 53 amp hours. This is 40, 53. And you see the much bigger one, which has, well, that's your Supreme. Lifetime guarantee Supreme, 84 amp hours. More powerful than original. How about that? So we have those plates in there. And, well, keep going. I don't want to write all of what I have here because some of it's like a little. So each cell has positive and negative plates, has positive and negative plates, alternating with insulating material between. I'll say between the plates. Alternating between the plates, and they are called separators. Separators. The plates inside the plates are a lead compound. We have the positive plate is lead peroxide. PB02. And the negative plate is pure spongy lead. Which is just a peanut butter. Each cell produces cell produces about 2.1 volts open circuit, or about 2.0 with a closed circuit voltage when fully charged. When it's not fully charged, what would the, say 80% charged, what would the cell produce about?
Voltage?
Yeah.
Same, right?
Yeah, about 2.1. So that's the point I was going for. Let's see. We can skip over this. Cells are placed into a box, obviously, or container. Each frame has a grid that contains the active material. Got that. Plates. Oh, plates sit on little shelves. Little shelves with space between the shelves. There's space below the plates. And this space below the plates allows debris and chunks of lead, piece of lead, I'll think of the word in a minute. Thank you, that's exactly what I wanted, lead sulfate, to fall down and it doesn't short out the plates. So space below the plate allows debris, allows debris to collect without shorting out the battery. Or that particular cell. Because you could get that. You short out one cell, so suddenly you're 10 volts. Why do I always have 10 volts? Well, because you got one cell completely shorted out. Oh, I actually wrote that. Space below the plates allows for debris to accumulate without shorting the cells. That's about what I wrote. Nice job there. Let's see, on the top, of course, we got the lugs where you connect to the next cell. Oh, well, that's inside. Connected together to create proper voltage. Top of the battery contains a plus and minus terminals. I don't think we have to write all this because it's rather obvious. We talked about the vent caps. They're conical little weights to close the vent at an angle to prevent its spillage. How many vents are there per cell? One per cell. That's how we know what kind of battery it is, how many voltage it is. So if it's got 6 vents, it's how many volts? 12. And if it's got 12 vents, it's 24. What happens if these little vents get plugged? Not likely, because there is acid keeping it clean. What if they get plugged? Build up gas. Then what happens to the battery? It bulges out. Starts getting a bulge in it. Bulge is bad for these, especially. And let's see. Battery is filled with electrolyte. Electrolyte. It is 30% sulfuric acid, with 70% water by volume. So that's the flooded lead acid battery. And like I said, kind of getting away from those, I think. They're still out there. They're still good batteries. I don't want one in my airplane anymore because of just the lead spillage. Because as we'll talk about in a minute, as you charge them, it gives off gases, it outgasses. And these gases are just vented outside. Or inside the battery box, which we have in the aircraft. So it vents out in the battery box, which then causes this corrosive material inside the battery box. So you always have to clean out your battery box, which then vents overboard, which then gets on the paint and starts wrinkling the paint. The paint comes off. You looked at the bottom of my 150 where my good friend added a bunch of electrolyte to the battery. There's no paint and a stripe going down the bottom of the belly. So it looked really nice. Nice little shiny spot on the airplane. So what we're getting into now is the sealed batteries. So the sealed, we'll call them a sealed lead acid battery. ACID acid battery. Which is not really the proper name. Call it that. I'll know what you're talking about, and I'm okay with it. But they're also known as the valve regulated lead acid battery. Or VRLA, valve regulated lead acid battery. I don't have a picture, but it looks like that without vent caps. So it's exactly the same, no vent caps. Some of you have seen the Gill batteries that we purchased many years ago. Don't get me started on that one. I'm a little sore about the fact that we threw them all away because they went bad. Because batteries, lead acid batteries, don't have a long shelf life. And so somebody had bought several $1,000s worth of them and just put them on the shelf and said, nobody touch them, we're saving them. Well, we saved them until we threw them away. So that worked out well. But I think I managed to save 2 of them. And after some lengthy charging periods. Anyway, but you can see they're pinks, they're Gill. And so you can see there's no servicing whatsoever on those. But I think you could find there's a little area where you could pop it off and get down there. Like I said, I like the Concord batteries, which are maroon and gray colored. And you definitely can get inside there and pry the top off without a whole lot of effort and look down inside there. And they are the same operating principle, if you will. I mean, they're still lead acid batteries, but instead of having this reservoir of electrolyte, much like our car batteries, where they would say, oh, it's maintenance-free car battery. To me, maybe I'm wrong about this, but having worked around them and looked at them, all it was this with caps on the top that had a reservoir where the fluid would go up inside of a cap, and then as the battery would then not be charged, I want to say cool down, but as the levels would go back down, these caps would then just drip back down. So it would just collect the moisture and then drip back in. And of course, they were maintenance free up until the time they weren't, and then you had to take those caps off and then add water. So it wasn't really a maintenance free battery. But these VRLA batteries, absolutely, you don't add anything to them ever, unless you're, like I said, my friend Joe, who did, and then it spews all over the place. All right, so let me see. Valve regulated, same operation as the lead acid battery. Battery is sealed and gases are stored within the battery at a sealed at a pressure of up to 1.5 psi, which doesn't sound like a lot, but if you think about 1.5 pounds of pressure on every single square inch of this battery, it's a lot of pressure on plastic. And so these batteries often do bulge out. So it's really common to see a VRLA battery not square, and it's bulging. Like, whoa, get away from that. It's totally normal. It's just building up the pressure, and then when you're done adding charging to it, it'll start just kind of going back down very slowly. And so nothing wrong with that. So pressure over 1.5 is obviously vented. So vents, pressures over 1.5 psi, which is kind of a minimal amount. It really doesn't do much, but they do bulge. So common to see VRLAs bulging. Bulge under pressure. There are 2 types. So we'll do this 1, 2, 3, 2 types. Maybe there's more at this point, and I don't really know how to identify which is which. It's just there are. There is the absorbed glass mat, so absorbed glass mat with the AGM. Electrolyte is contained within glass mats that act like a sponge and keep the electrolyte next to the plates rather than just having this electrolyte sloshing around inside. So, you know, a little SpongeBob in there, and that's what it's doing. Otherwise, it's the same concept. And the gel battery, well, we'll put that here. So, yeah.
You wrote down vents pressure over 1.5?
That's, yep. So if it gets over 1.5 psi, it will it'll vent it.
So
Builds up to 1.5 psi, and then anything over that, it will pop off a cap.
okay. So they're not like these vents, is what you're saying.
Mm-mm.
Got it.
Tries to keep it inside, but you can't keep it all in because it'll blow the casing if you get too much.
Over 1.5.
Yep. Let's see, absorbed glass mat, electrolyte. Electrolyte is contained within glass mats. Within glass, like fiberglass mats. Mats. I have 2 T's. I want 2 T's. That act like a sponge. And keep electrolyte next to plates. So you have absolutely no spillage with this kind of battery. It obviously uses a lot less electrolyte. And we have the gel batteries. Also called a gel cell. And this one, they actually take the electrolyte and mix it with silica gel, so it's this nasty gel kind of a conglomeration. Electrolyte is mixed with silica gel, silica to create a gel. All right. So sealed batteries. Sealed batteries are not serviceable. In other words, you can't add water or electrolyte. But you do have to service them, and that every year you still have to do the same instructions for continued airworthiness. Pull out the battery, do a measured discharge test on it, and then put it back in service. But you're not going to take off the caps, you're not going to do an electrolyte check, you're not going to do a hydrometer check. It works or it doesn't. You do have to be careful when you charge these batteries, so use caution when charging. Because they don't outgas. So if you put too much amperage on the battery and it wants to outgas that hydrogen, it can't. So you gotta be really careful with it. Too much current causes it to way bulge out. All right. Let's talk about operating theory. Let's see here. The operating theory, you don't have to worry about. Let me see. I there's a video. You want to watch it?
Yeah.
Okay. Oops, wait a minute. Good. Resume. This is what they do. I stole this from the video. All right, battery converts chemical energy into electrical energy. The positive plate, called the cathode, the negative plate, called the anode. Electrolyte is
30% water.
30% sulfuric acid. All right. One, the cathode is made of lead dioxide, and the anode is made of lead, spongy lead, or PB for peanut butter and jelly. During the discharge, the sulfuric acid breaks up into two parts, hydrogen ions with a plus charge and sulfate ions with a negative charge. The sulfate ions combine with the lead plate and form lead sulfate. Lead sulfate is not a good thing. That is a bad thing, giving up their negative charge, which gives the lead plates more electrons. So the takeaway from this slide that I would want you to know, because there's a few things I really want you to know about this, maybe 3, 4 things. So number one, during the discharge process, what forms on the lead plate? Lead sulfate. Lead sulfate is a bad thing. And that's really what kills batteries over time, is this lead sulfate buildup. And something to remember, if you leave your battery dead, you're going to get the lead sulfate. So that's why it's terrible. Like we have a van that we don't use very often, Ford van, because it's huge and takes up a bunch of gas. So, the whole family goes somewhere, we take the van, we get out of the van, somebody hits the lights on the way out, now the overhead lights stay on, and now the battery goes dead the next day, but it sits dead for a month and a half, go to start it, and it won't work. Well, now what? Battery's been sitting dead for, you can turn the lights back on, battery's been sitting dead for 2 to 3 weeks, and now we're going to get lead sulfate forced onto the plates, which won't allow it to charge anymore. Now you need a new battery. Like, what was a new battery? Well, it was until you got the lead sulfate all built up on it. Also, there are ways to get rid of the lead sulfate buildup, which we'll talk about. All right, so during discharge, the hydrogen ions combine with oxygen in the lead peroxide, forming water. Okay, so something else you want to take away from here. During discharge, the hydrogen ions combine with oxygen in the lead peroxide, forming water. So what happens to the electrolyte is where it's 30% and 70%, 30% acid, 70% water, it starts shifting and it starts going more and more towards water. What's that? Still diluted. Yes, so that's why when you use a hydrometer in a battery, it's one of the ways you can check the state of charge. So if I could just have something in here that said, well, it's mostly water. Well, if I mixed it correctly and I put the correct 30-70% mixture in there, and the battery's all charged up, and I took a hydrometer and I measured it, and I go, wow, that's like 30% acid and 70% water. Now discharge the battery, and that acid, if you will, starts to go away, and I'm left with water. So if I did a hydrometer test, I'm like, that's mostly water. Yeah, it's mostly water. Your battery's dead. Okay? So lead peroxide, and as it dies, lead sulfate, as it dies, the electrolyte turns more into water. Okay. Process takes electrons from the positive plate, making the plate more positive. The lead peroxide combines with sulfate ions to create lead sulfate. That's bad. Combine the chemical reaction that the positive plate has a deficiency of electrons while the positive plate has an excess supply of electrons. So let's see, the positive plate has a deficiency of electrons while the negative plate has an excess of electrons to supply power. Makes sense there. During discharge, we'll continue until the load is disconnected or a charging current is applied. Let me see. During charging process, the electromechanical process is reversed. So we take the battery, we discharge it, we get the lead sulfate happens, we don't like that. The electrolyte turns into more of a water, so we can tell that. So the battery starts its discharge, now we want to charge it. So we hook up an alternator or generator, which simply reverses the process and causes the chemical reaction to go back the other way. And we could go through this. Something a lot of people kind of get wrong on this whole charging process, and maybe I'll just stop right here and just kind of say. So we have a battery, right? And the battery goes to a bus bar, just to sort of keep it simple. And it's also attached to the bus bar. We have an alternator. I'll put alternator so you don't think it's a ALT alternator. All right, so when the alternator's not running, then electrons will, how do we do this? The negative, the positive. We'll put a load on here. So we'll just make a big load. There's my load. All right. So when the alternator is offline, right, the battery has to supply electrons to the load, and so it's pretty much going to look like that. Yeah. Okay. So it supplies to the load. But as soon as we start the engine and bring the alternator online, now the alternator is going to supply electrons to the load and to the battery. And the process of charging the battery is reversed. So a little bit ago, we had the battery supplying electrons to the load, and it went out and up this way. But the blue, alternator on, we're simply supplying electrons backwards to the battery, the negative in. Yeah.
So where do the electrons go after the load? Do they go back to the alternator, or do they go to the other side of the battery too?
With the alternator running?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I just do that. Oops, gotta be blue. So through the load, bus, and back down if we're using electron theory flow, and we do the same thing. But we could look at it the other way and say, well, in conventional theory, it's, I don't want to confuse you, but obviously if conventional theory, you'd say, well, the battery supplies power to the bus through the load and then back around the ground. And then the alternator comes online and then it supplies power to the bus, and the power then goes to the bus and goes through all the loads, which the battery becomes nothing more than a load. And I'm trying to remember where everybody gets screwed up here. Let me think. Because it shouldn't be. Let me see. During charging of a lead acid battery, the charger supplies electrons to the what terminal?
Surprises to.
During charging of the battery,
Oh yeah, it goes to the negative terminal.
during charging of the battery, the charger, what's the charger? Alternator, supplies electrons to the, now of course we're talking about electrons, so we have to think about conventional or electron theory.
Electron.
I would go electron theory. What does the charger, where is it supplying its electrons?
To the negative terminal.
To the grounds. So you don't get that, that should be a little flag like, hey, something's wrong. I don't get something here. Because you should understand that in electron theory flow, when the battery is supplying power, it's going to come out and up this way.
Mm-hmm.
But as soon as the alternator's online, that's a load and that's a load. The battery's just a load at that point.
The charger has to supply more amperage or voltage to charge.
What's that?
The alternator has to supply more voltage to the battery to charge it.
Yes, so if the battery is 12.5 volts, this has to be set above 12.5. Otherwise, the battery, so if this was like at 10,
Yeah.
and this is at 12, and this is on, especially if it's a generator, if you're not careful with the generator, it'll actually drive the generator like a little motor.
And like a reverse polarity than what you meant?
No. So I don't think an alternator might, but I know a generator will. So if it's a generator, which is just an old-fashioned alternator, if the alternator was at 10, I'm sorry, if the alternator generator was working and it was putting out 10 volts and the battery's at 12, battery's more. So which way is this going to supply current, or is the battery going to supply current? So the battery will literally supply current up into the generator and drive the generator like a little motor. And we'll talk about that. So you have to have a reverse current cutout to actually stop it from doing that. It is, yeah, and a three-piece regulator, that's part of it. And the new ones are just solid state, but you still have to have reverse current cutout. Actually, I should say, yeah, but if it's an alternator, it just has diodes, so it won't. So diodes in an alternator will keep it from doing that, but a generator will do it. Does that answer your question?
Mostly.
Okay, but that's why alternator outputs are always in the 14 volt range or 28 volts, because the battery has to be less than. So the battery's got to be 12 and a half, right? 13. This has to be 14 and a half to make this a load once it starts working, because this is less voltage. So if it's less voltage, that makes it negative. So current flows up through the battery and charges it.
Got it.
So again, when the alternator is offline, engine's not running, we're sitting there on the ground, talking on the radio, doing our checks, this supplies all the current to all of the loads. We start the aircraft, bring the alternator online, because literally aircraft, it's not like a car where you start it, the alternator is automatic. My airplane, it's 2 switches. I have the master switch and then the alternator switch. You guys don't have Cessnas, but you still have an alternator switch, probably, right? Yeah, so we have alternator. We can turn the alternator on off. It's a switch. You don't have that in a car. So start the aircraft, get the engine going. I always hit my both of them on, so my alternator is already on, doesn't bother me. But then once it's going and the alternator now runs, then the battery is a load. It's a problem. And it's not a big problem, but it's like, hey, alternator's got to take care of it. We want that because we want it to charge up and everything. All right, so back to the question that I had up on there. During the charging process, the alternator supplies electrons to what? The negative terminal, the positive terminal?
Negative.
Negative terminal, correct. Otherwise, it would be weird. It would be like, oh, so you're saying it goes this way and then somehow finds its way to the bus on its own and goes this way, but then has to turn around and go back. I don't know. So, wouldn't do that. Don't be weird. All right. Oops, okay, so during charging, that's what made me think of it. The alternator putting electrons into the negative side. See, positive hydrogen ions are attracted to the excessive electrons on the negative plate, which reacts with the lead sulfate to reform sulfuric acid and lead. Don't do that. Reform sulfuric acid. So it means that during charging, what do we get back into the water? Sulfuric acid. All right. And it gets rid of the lead sulfate. Battery is now full. Electrical energy has been converted to chemical energy. Woo! Continuing to charge the battery after it is full or applying too much charging current will cause the water to break down into hydrogen and oxygen. All right, so continuing to charge the battery. So how do we stop charging the battery in flight? You don't. You don't. No, don't turn off your alternator. You don't. It's sort of a self-regulating thing, because as the battery charges up, its charging resistance goes up. So it takes a lot less amps. So it just starts trickle charging on its own. So it's happy, it just trickle charges, and it's just sort of the way it's designed. As long as your voltage regulator in the aircraft isn't set too high. If your voltage regulator is set too high in the aircraft, then you're going to apply, say, 16.5 volts to the battery. Then what's the battery going to do? Then it's going to overcharge. Then it's going to off gas, and you're going to get what kind of gas? Hydrogen gas. So not only do you get the hydrogen gas, assuming that does nothing. Well, if you can light it on fire in the right spot, you get an afterburner. So you have the hydrogen gas. But I think more importantly, assuming it doesn't explode, which would be a small problem, you're going to get that venting out of the acid, which is corrosive to the aircraft, which causes all kinds of problems. You have Piper, right? Yeah, your battery's next to the spar, huh?
Yeah, under the back seat.
Yeah, under the back seat next to the spar. So if you have a lot of acid and corrosiveness getting onto the carry-through spar that holds the wings on. Some people see that as a problem. So, in fact, I think there is an airworthiness directive on your plane, isn't there, about doing something with?
I mean, the battery's in a plastic box, and it is vented.
Yeah.
To the outside.
Yeah, I think, but some of the early ones, I think there was a problem with them.
There was a problem with the springs potentially
Oh, gosh.
touching the top.
Oh my gosh.
Battery terminal.
Oh, my seat's getting warm. See what he's saying? So if you have the post, you have the springs in the seat, and you sit down on it, the springs come down. You're like, I love it back here. You got heated seats, man. This plane is really nice. How do you turn them off?
What's that smell?
Yeah. So hydrogen and oxygen bubble out of the electrolyte and form hydrogen and oxygen gas. Oh, we got hydrogen and oxygen. What could possibly go wrong? All right, so, well, what goes wrong is that. We already seen that, so. All right, so takeaway from that. What were my takeaways? Big takeaways. So let's see. As battery discharges, as the electrolyte becomes more waterish,
Waterway.
water-like, more like water. We'll get a little more scientific in a little bit, but I like it. I really want to say it becomes more like water. Also, as it discharges, lead sulfate is formed, which is bad. I mean, it's part of the process. It's not a big deal as long as you charge your battery back up, but
And that lead sulfate, when it forms on the plates.
yes. As battery charges, we'll put this electrons enter the negative plate, negative side, so that we don't forget we said that. And also, the electrolyte becomes more acidic.
So as the battery discharges, it becomes less acidic.
Yes,
And
more like water. Waterish. All right, let me see. These are all the things I wrote down here. Let's see. The actual chemical process that occurs is beyond the scope of this class and not relevant to your job as a mechanic. However, the result of the chemical reaction is important. While delivering current, sulfuric acid breaks up into two parts, positive hydrogen ions and negative sulfate ions. These are all the things you're not going to have to write now. Lead sulfate ions combine with the lead plate, the spongy lead, and form lead sulfate. At the same time, sulfate ions give up negative charge to the lead plate. Lead plate becomes more negative, and the sulfate ions become neutral. Hydrogen ions go into the positive plate and combine with the oxygen lead peroxide plate. Hydrogen plus oxygen equals water, so water is produced. This means that the electrolyte will become more water-like as the battery is discharged. We got that?
Yes.
That's very important. Critical important. At the same time, taking electrons from the plate, making more positive or electron deficient. Some sulfuric acid combines with lead on positive plate and forms lead sulfate. Lead sulfate is bad. The chemical process continues until both plates are covered in lead sulfate. Both plates, lead sulfate, not good. Lead sulfate is highly resistant to current flow, high resistance. So it's hard to get rid of. Leaving a battery in a discharged state will damage the, I'm going to write this one. Leaving the battery in a discharged state. Leaving the battery in a discharged state. Let's see, state will damage the battery. Because lead sulfate will bond with the plate. Battery because lead sulfate will bond with the plate. Means it doesn't come off. And that's not a big deal. You just buy a new battery, right? And then how much could a battery cost? Yeah. I just priced one out 2 days ago with Ian for my airplane. 400? 405 plus shipping. My plane's a 77. You guys know Harry from second year? He has the black Tesla. He's got a 78 182. His is 24 volt. His battery was double that cost. So let's hear it for 12 volts. So yeah, not a big deal. It's just $400 battery. Let me see. As battery discharges, electrolyte becomes more water-like. The state of a battery can be checked. The state, it will make sure at that point. The state of a battery, the state of a battery charge, battery charge can be checked with a hydrometer. See, charging process, current is passed in the battery at a voltage greater than battery voltage into the current is passed to the battery at a voltage greater than the battery into which side of the battery? Negative side. This causes current. So I don't want to write this. Current does flow backwards in the battery.
Why do you do that?
Well, because if we say it goes from negative to positive, inside the battery it goes from positive to negative. No, I'm just going to leave that out. Let me see. Hey, we got all that. All right. Overcharging the battery. I think we kind of covered this. Overcharging. What happens if you overcharge? You get what? Hydrogen gas. All right. And I told you the story yesterday about charging the battery in the paint room and the hydrogen and the gas and yeah. So that. So when you are overcharging a battery or when you've reached the fully charged state, they do start to boil, literally. So you can pull the caps off and just look in there and you'll see little bubbles start to come. And the more you charge it, the more those bubbles start to become bigger and bigger and bigger until they start boiling and spitting all over the place. So you just watch that. That's why, like my battery over there, all the caps are unscrewed and just set on top. That way, if there was any sort of blockage of the cap, you won't get this bulging or explosion. The cap is just sitting there and it'll just pop the cap off a little bit. So they're just sitting there. They're all unscrewed, which is just something, a good thing to do. Oh, there we go. We'll get to that. Okay. What else do I have on here? Boiling battery will vent acid. When this gets in the aircraft, it causes corrosion. I've said that. You can write that if you want. We'll write all these points here. So I don't know where I'm at. So I've skipped a bunch of stuff. Puts me on J on my thing. So as a mechanic, you need to understand. You need to understand. So I might have skipped a few because I was condensed. We got to the key points, which I said I was going to do. All right, what do we need to understand? Well, most of this is stuff I've just already said. Hydrogen gas. Hydrogen gas is very explosive. Well, I don't know if it's very explosive, it's explosive. So sparks. Sparks near a charging battery can explode the battery. So, all right, I've got this battery on a charger, and maybe I've screwed up a little bit. I got the amperage too high, or I set the amperage right and waited too long to take it off, and so I got my positive and negative, and I got this bubbling, and got this little cloud of hydrogen gas. I'm like, oh man, I should have taken out the charger. So I reach up and I grab the clamp, and I pull it off, and it arcs right there when I pulled it off.
Boom.
Boom. So on a charging battery, never disconnect it. Always turn off the power, kill it, then take it off. And that goes back to, you know, when you're charging, like somebody has a dead car, and you're gonna, dead car over here, good car here. So good car, dead car. Hey, I need a jump. All right, so you take the jumper cables and you connect them. And I don't think it really matters which way you go when you're going. I try to be careful when I connect them here, and I got, you know, now live ends on it. It's better if you go over here and they're somewhat dead when you go over here. But anyway, you connect the two, and you start charging this battery, and you get the car started. Which one do you disconnect first? You go to the good car. Why do you go to the good car?
Good one at all.
What's that?
It's got the good battery.
It's not charging.
Not
Well,
It's
that's
not
higher
the
power.
one overcharging. So over there, you've got 12 volts coming in here, plus the alternator now started to run. I don't know. It's probably not going to happen. But this one's the one being charged, so this one's the one generating all of the hydrogen. This one was already charged, so probably not. So you disconnect this side first.
Yeah, because that becomes actually your power supply.
Yes.
So on that.
So
Right.
your last connection should be a ground away from the battery.
Okay, well now that's another thing. So if I'm working on an airplane and here's my battery, and you know, like my airplane, I got to come in a little side door over here, so I'm all hunched down and I'm working this way, and I got my positive here, my negative over here, right? So if I want to connect the battery, you always want to connect the positive first, then the negative, and then when you disconnect, negative first, positive. So positive stays on the longest. And the reason why is because you're back in there, and so I put the positive on. Well, not me. We'll put the negative on first. Right, put the negative, forget the ground. It's right there. Get the ground on. And then I reach over and I put this one, and I go to tighten it, and the wrench comes across, and it hits, because, you know, my airplane, the firewall, the edge of the airplane's right there, and my wrench touches the edge of the aircraft. What do I get? A little weld job going on there. My wrench starts welding to the airplane. So that's really dangerous. But if the negative is off, I can take this and touch it to anything I want, because negative's off. You don't have the negative connected, you got nothing. So put the negative, positive on first, connect it, tighten it, then I put the negative on. Now, what happens if I'm wrenching on the negative and I touch from here to the edge of the aircraft?
Nothing because
Not a damn thing. It's already down right here. This cable just goes to right here, so nobody cares. But if I connect the wrench from here to here, all bets are off. It's gonna get a lot of amps. So then when you go to take it off, of course, it's the same thing. You do it here because if you touch the aircraft, it doesn't hurt. Just don't touch that. Then once that's off, this can touch anything except for that, and you're good to go.
Don't leave any switches on.
Yeah, try not to leave any switches on, but there's always.
You have a path to ground.
Yeah.
Potential.
Yeah, there's always some power on because you have your clock and stuff running. Mine always sparks when I do it. All right, hydrogen gas, sparks, flood a battery. All right, let's see, what else do I have? I didn't realize I wrote that, but I did. So this is why battery being charged / jumped. So battery being charged or jumped is disconnected first. I mean, is never. What did I write? I wrote battery jumped is never disconnected at the battery. The battery being jump charged is not disconnected at the battery. Always disconnect power source first. All right, that brings us right up to break time.